tell you a little bit about my background. I've been making music primarily with machines, equipment, gear, computers for 27 years. And my name is Omar Soriano, and I am a music producer. These days I mostly work in Latin-related genres. Over the 27 years I've been doing music, I've gone through a lot of things. You asked me what got me started. I got started with hip-hop. I first heard Mona Lisa by Slick Rick in early 1989, and I said, I want to do that. I want to rap like Slick Rick raps. And when you start off making music and you're a young kid from the city, from Newark, New Jersey, we weren't entirely privileged. So when you grow up like that, you have to be resourceful. There was nobody to produce me. This wasn't, Dad, can you take me to a studio and give me some studio time? Or Mom, I think I need piano lessons. None of that was happening. It was me, and I had to figure out how to make sounds for myself to accompany my rapping. I was in the 8th grade at the time. The year before, I was in the 7th grade, and I remember my dad asking me what I would like as a gift if I were to make the honor roll. I remember thinking, I don't need a gift to make honor roll. I want to make the honor roll because I loved school as a kid. I was a nerd like that. But I used that, I said, okay, if you really want to get me something, I know what I want. At the time, Casio was advertising the Casio SK1 sampling keyboard. That was the first consumer grade keyboard that allowed you to sample sounds. And so I made the honor roll, and my dad came through and he got me the Casio SK1. I got bitten by that bug in '89, a year later, to want to make music like seriously. I had that, and I had a dual cassette boombox that belonged to the whole family. It was nobody's in particular, but I commandeered it. I made it my own for the next 5 years. Between that little keyboard and that boombox, that was my studio. That was the beginning of my first studio. Until 2 years later, I bought a drum machine. I bought a Boss drum machine off of my cousin for $50 that my aunt had given me $50 for Christmas, and I used that $50 to buy from a drum machine for her son. That was the beginnings of my studio, and from the very beginning, it was less about, I don't know how to play any of this, but I want to make that boom bap sound that Slick Rick and KRS-One. I came of age during the golden age of hip hop. If you had a decent sampler, you can make really great hip hop. I didn't have a decent sampler. I remember wanting an EMU SP1200 for years. To this day, I don't have one because other things came out that superseded the need for an EMU SP1200. I wanted an SP1200 from about the 8th grade till about my sophomore year in college, and I never got one because they were too expensive until I finally got a Macintosh Color Classic, which had 8-bit sampling on it, and I learned how to use that Mac Color Classic to do 8-bit sampling, and then I was finally doing more legit hip-hop in my sophomore year in college. All that continued, I went through different samplers, coming up as a hip-hop producer, not knowing any musical theory whatsoever. I was doing music for 15 years before I had any concept whatsoever of music theory. I remember buying a Roland XP50, not having a clue as to how to play piano, but I bought this professional grade keyboard. It was my first piece of professional gear. Not knowing at all how to play piano, but I bought it because I needed sounds. And I knew I wanted some serious sounds to make some serious hip hop. And all of that continued until 2003, at which point I'd already been making music for about 14 years. Coming to a place musically where I said, I can't just make these 2-bar loops for the rest of my musical career. I have all these musical ideas swimming around in my head. I have violins and strings and brass, and I'm limited to samples and knocking out one-finger melodies on piano. Around that time, PBS used to show, especially during Fun Drive time, they used to show Scott the Piano Guy on Channel 13 in New Jersey. And I remember watching Scott the Piano Guy on Channel 13 when a humongous light bulb just went on. It was like Scott the Piano Guy broke down how a major chord works, how you go from a C major to an F major to a G major while keeping your hand in the same position, that triad, and a light bulb went off for me, not just how chords were shaped, because I had been messing around with chords without knowing much. The light bulb that went off listening to Scott the Piano Guy is he was the first one to connect the piano to how song structure works. He was the first one to introduce the concept of here's where you start, and then you move here, and then you move here. Now there's lots of other ways you can move, and they're going to sound weird and interesting, but here's fundamental 1, 4, 5. And when I wrapped my head around that, I ran with it. I instantly began writing music as soon as I wrapped my head around basic chord progressions. And at the time, I was mostly focused on worship music. I spent 2003, 2004, 2005 mostly writing really simple, harmonically simple, congregational type worship songs. That was the seeds of my songwriting. But I still wasn't serious about the piano. I was serious about songwriting and serious about producing and arranging. But I still had not made a decision to get serious about piano. I noodled around with it. I'd play around with it once a week. But I had an inherent frustration with the instrument. Pianos in general, keyboards in general. I was frustrated by the 12 different keys. I was frustrated by the idea of learning to play a musical figure, such as a melody, such as a chord progression. And the moment I had to now do it in E flat instead of C, in which I had learned it, I had to relearn it essentially in E flat because my mind didn't automatically transpose things. It was like, my goodness, I'm doing twice as much work just to learn how to do the same darn thing I just learned how to play in another key. I kept thinking, there's gotta be a better way. Someday, somebody is gonna come up with a better way to do keyboard, a better way to do piano. And that someday for me came late 2008. I was on an online forum that I still visit to this day, The Flip Side. As part of a random conversation one day on the forum, someone mentioned that the idea was being thrown around that in a future version of FL Studios, they were going to introduce what they called a Janko keyboard layout as an alternative to the traditional piano layout. And this began a debate on the forum. Some people thought it was a horrible idea, but it was my first exposure to the idea of an isomorphic keyboard to Janko. And I latched onto this idea like a vice grip. I said, wait. Does this thing do what it says it does? Are you honestly saying if I play a chord and I have that one shape, I can just move that up and down and play the same chord? Like, where has this been all my life? I went from not knowing about it to about a week later reading everything there was on the internet and anywhere I could find about it and becoming a Janko advocate and an evangelist. And to this day, I still consider myself an evangelist for Janko form. The problem was nobody was making it. And as I researched around, I found the Lippens Company in Japan was making their CT312. And 0809 saying, I want that keyboard, but I can't afford it right now. Because the chromatone at that time was priced at the equivalent in US dollars of $1,500, and I wasn't in a position to pay $1,500. But I got to this weird place where I said, I'm not even gonna bother learning traditional piano, because I know that's the instrument I want to play. And so I went from 09 to 14, 5 years wanting a chromatone, wanting something with a Janko layout, until finally in 2014 I pulled the trigger. Actually, let me go back a little bit. In 2013 is when I said, I'm not sure if I'm ever getting a Janko layout. And at that time, I had already gotten serious about learning salsa and arranging salsa. Around 2010, I started getting serious about studying salsa. And in 2011, I made a decision I want to be a producer and arranger of either salsa or Afro-Cuban music in general, because salsa is kind of a specific configuration with a really strict, rigid set of rules. And the moment you go left or right, people say that's not salsa. And I'm not into all those limitations, but I love salsa. And I said, I want to do something Afro-Cuban related that I sense this is direction. In the year 2010, I visited Cali, Colombia, which many people consider to be the salsa capital of the world. This is a place that eats, lives, breathes salsa. You go down to the corner store, they're playing salsa. You're in a cab, they're playing good salsa. So this place has salsa in the marrow of their bones. There's like a full immersion experience the few weeks I was there. When I came back to the United States with salsa on the brain. And that came at such a critical time in my musical development, because at that time I had been doing neo-soul for coming in on maybe 8 years. I spent about a little bit over 10 years working on hip-hop. And then it's very natural to grow from hip-hop into things that influence hip-hop, like funk and soul and classic R&B and stuff like that. I spent about 10 years doing one, and then about 10 years doing soul and funk, and I got to a place where I felt with neo-soul and funk that I felt I had said most of what I had to say in those genres. Not everything. So I still work in those genres, and I still take clients in those genres. But I got to a place where I said, I can't do these handful of genres for the rest of my musical career, because I got to this place where my head was exploding with these large-scale orchestral ideas, and I said, I need a bigger genre that can hold some of these ideas that I have. So I came to this crossroads. Part of me wanted to go a classical / film score route, because I looked at those genres. I looked at film score, not so much classical can be kind of hoity-toity, but I looked at film score and I said, man, that genre is so large. There's not an idea I can have that I couldn't do in that genre. It's huge, it's big, it's massive. And I like digging into the original genres that eventually got crystallized and hardened into what we now call salsa. And I sometimes like leapfrogging over salsa and going back to those original genres and pulling ideas from those. And that's where I get a lot of my new ideas I'm working on, in 2015, 2016. More of my ideas come from the older genres. Anyway, so as I was transitioning into becoming a salsa producer and a salsa arranger, then on the other hand, there was salsa. And I looked at salsa, I listened to salsa, perhaps it's a better way to say it, and I said, that's a genre that can hold a lot of ideas. There's enough instrumentation, there's enough room. I said, I could see salsa keeping me busy for at least 10, 15 years without getting bored of it. And so around 2011, I made a transition. I decided I'm going to become a Latin music producer. And I'm not going to abandon everything I learned in the African American tradition. I'm not going to abandon what I learned in hip hop and in soul and in disco and in funk. I'm going to bring that with me into Latin music, which is why my Latin music gets picked on by the purists. They'll say, oh, that sounds like R&B, or that sounds like funk, or the big one I get is, I'm not sure that's salsa. That's okay. And which is why I often don't use the term salsa. I prefer the term Afro-Cuban. I prefer talking about the original elements of what would eventually become salsa. I'm talking in terms of guaguancó and son montuno and cha-cha-cha and mambo. What I learned pretty quickly is in the salsa scene, the salsa scene is a live scene. It's a live music. So to say, hey, I have an idea, check it out, and pressing play on a piece of gear is nowhere near as impressive as saying, hey, I've got this idea that I came up with the other day, listen to it, it goes like this. That's something else. And the tradition in salsa is that all the great arrangers play an instrument. Right? So Willie Colon plays trombone, and Bobby Valentin plays bass, and Larry Harlow plays piano, plays piano. And so in this world, in this Latin world, to come onto the scene and say, I have these musical ideas, but I can't play them, is very much to come empty-handed to the scene. They don't want to hear what you have to say unless you can play it somehow. A few years ago, I said, I need to start getting serious with my key. I was at that place where I knew I wanted to play Janko. And I said, I can't wait until I have a Janko or a Croatone or anything. I need to start getting serious about piano now. Which is always the right thing to do. If you're ever stuck with what should I do something. So I took the piano I had at the time, the traditional piano I had. I said, I'm going to start practicing every day. I'm going to start playing my montunos, I'm going to start playing my scales. And for 13 months, which is not a long time, I played piano almost every day until I got to a place where I had an opportunity was an opportunity created between the chromatone's price dropping and me having some cash on hand. I said, I'm going to take the plunge. And so I purchased a chromatone. I've been playing that for 2 years. When I started practicing every day, I started learning the Latin styles on keys. I started studying some jazz. And what I will say, now I don't think enough people have said this about the Janko layout. This layout is tailor-made for jazz and salsa. Any genre of music where the key center is changing throughout the song will be that much easier to play on a Janko keyboard. So a typical progression in jazz would be 2, 5, 1, but then drop back to the 3 and the 6. So if you have that right there is various times easier to play on a Janko layout than it would be on a traditional piano, because when you drop back to that 3, you don't have to relearn a fingering. You're just borrowing the fingering that you used on 2/5. Reuse, reuse. And so that's an example from jazz. In salsa, where you might be playing a mambo that goes more down here, you'd play. That's not hard. I'm not gonna say it's hard on a traditional piano, but that's, I mean, you could be brain dead and do that on the Janko layout. It's just a minor chord voicing played in both hands, and then you transpose it, and you got that kind of mambo all over the place in salsa, where in jazz they call it planing, where you're playing one figure and then you just modulate up a key, a tone or a semitone. And so the fact that I needed to be, or am becoming, a competent keyboardist, I needed to do that in a rapid amount of time. And the fact that a Janko keyboard came into my life at the same time was very fortuitous. I think of that as a blessing, because if I had to struggle through diatonic piano while I'm growing as a salsa arranger, I wouldn't be where I am now as a keyboardist if I had to trudge through it